Hey guys, and welcome back to GCC. I'm Damon, and today I want to take a look at the Radeon RX 560. So this one is the Gigabyte Gaming OC edition. It has 1024 stream processors, so 16 CUs. It has 4 gigs of GDDR5 running at 7000 megahertz on a 128-bit bus. And the core clock is right around 1230 megahertz, sometimes higher, not usually much lower ever. So my goal for today was to see how the RX 560 handles modern games, so modern AAA games released in the last 2, 3, maybe 4 years, and to see if it can hit 60 frames per second on most of these games. All of my testing was run on my personal rig, which is an i7-4790K, overclocked to 4.8 gigahertz. I've got 16 gigabytes of DDR3 at 1600 megahertz, an EVGA 850 watt G3, and an ASRock Z97 Extreme 4 motherboard. Yeah, that should be good. So starting off with Rise of the Tomb Raider, we had an overall average of 62.46 at 1080p on the high preset. So that's actually pretty solid. The Syria portion of the in-game benchmark had an average of 51.37, so that was definitely below 60, but the Mountain Peaks had an average of 78.8, so I was well above the 60 frames per second that I'm targeting. So in Rise of the Tomb Raider, on high preset, it looks like this card can do really, really well. In The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt at 1080p on the medium preset, while exploring the world, I had an average of 45.73 frames per second, a minimum of 34, and a max of 51. And then in the city, we had an average of 39.3 with a max of only 43 and a minimum of 35. So those are decent numbers, but definitely below the 60 target that I was hoping for. In Deus Ex Mankind Divided at 1080p on the high preset, the average was only 31.4 with a low of 19.6 and a max of 40.9. So I would not recommend the high preset for this game. In the medium preset, we had an average of 38 with a max of 47.8 and a minimum of 29.9, so right at that 30 frames per second. And then on the lowest settings possible, while still maintaining 1080p and 100% resolution scale, I had an average of 47.3 with a max of 60.5 and a minimum of 37.4. So definitely playable and probably the most enjoyable at the low preset because it still looks great. So in Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p on the high preset, we had an average of 80.1 with a max of 206.2 and a minimum of 32.2. And on the very high preset, we had an average of 73 frames per second with a max of 218.4 and a minimum of 29.4. So definitely a great card for Rainbow Six Siege if you're looking to build a budget land box or if you're upgrading your main rig. In Middle-earth Shadow of Mordor at 1080p on the very high preset, we had an average of 59.45 with a max of 77.61 and a minimum of 42.76. So those are good numbers with the average sitting right at that 60 frames per second mark. At the medium preset, we had an average of 79.7 with a min and max of 58 and 103. And at the lowest settings, the average was 116 frames per second with a max of 160 and a minimum of 80.5. So at the lowest preset, you can have some very, very high numbers depending on what's going on screen. In Fortnite, on the Epic preset in 1080p, the average was 49.95, the max was 90, and the minimum was 31. In the high preset, the average was 61.01, max of 81, and a minimum of 44. Then on the medium preset, the average was 91.07 with a max of 161 and a minimum of 37. So medium saw some really good numbers, but high is definitely still playable and has some really great render distance and stuff like that. So I'd probably go with the high preset if you're going to play Fortnite with a 560. For Apex Legends, I'm going to put on screen probably around here somewhere the actual settings that I use to get this so you can mimic them if you are trying to play Apex Legends on a 560. But I'll just call them high, medium, and the lowest settings. So for high, we saw an average of 34.9, a max of 120, and a minimum of 22. For medium, we saw an average of 41.9, max of 60, and a minimum of 26. And then at the lowest possible settings, while still at 1080p 100% resolution scale, the average was 52.8, max of 78, and a minimum of 30. So even at the lowest settings, you're not going to get a steady, constant 60 frames per second, but it'll be very playable and, not at all a bad experience. In Metro Last Light at high quality, we had an average of 38.27 with a max of 136.8 and a minimum of 15.55. And at low quality, we had an average of 96.4 with a max of 196 and a minimum of 23.1. So at low quality, you're going to get a very, very good frame rate most of the time. When I tested Overwatch, I created a custom game on Blizzard World to try to reduce the amount of variables that I introduced, and then just changed the graphical settings, then did a restart in between each test. So at high quality, 100% resolution scale at 1080p, VSync off, obviously. Average was 97.3 with a max of 131 and a minimum of 75. So at the high settings, you're getting really, really great frame rates. And at low, if you have like a high refresh monitor, the average was 132.1 with a max of 150.7 and a minimum of 97. So the 560 really did well with low qualities and high qualities in Overwatch. For Sniper Elite 4, I ran two different tests, one using DirectX 11 and one using DirectX 12, both at high quality settings. So for DirectX 11, the average frame rate was 51.6 with a max of 63 and a minimum of 38. And then in DirectX 12, the average was 56.5 with a max of 80.7 and a minimum of 40.6. So I would definitely recommend DirectX 12 for this title. This GPU did really, really well at high settings with that average frame rate right around 60. So you could drop a couple settings and get that super solid 60 very easily. For Battlefield 5, I did 4 tests, 2 using DirectX 11 and 2 using DirectX 12. So for high in DX11, the average was 40.4 with a max of 48.2 and a min of 32.7. High DirectX 12 was an average of 41.7 with a max of 46.5 and a minimum of 36.5. So the minimum frame rate was higher as well as the average, although slightly lower max frame rate, using DirectX 12 in the high preset. Low in DirectX 11 had an average frame rate of 68.7, max of 79.9, and a minimum of 49.9. And then in low DirectX 12, the average was 62.4 with a max of 72.2 and a minimum of 48.9. So for this title, if you're going to do high, I recommend DX12. If you're going to do low, I recommend DX11. CSGO is the last game that I benchmarked. I did a custom match on Rust 2 with bots to try and get rid of those extra variables. At the high settings, I had an average of 134.5 with a max of 213.8 and a minimum frame rate of 85.5. And then on the lowest settings, the average was 213.7 with a max of 261.4 and a minimum of 159.3. And then lastly, I ran the BMW benchmark in Blender, and that took 11 minutes and 56 seconds. So overall, I am actually really impressed with this card. It did better than I thought it was going to. User benchmark, I know, it's user benchmark. You're not supposed to use that to actually compare GPUs that much. However, on there, it is less powerful than a 1050 Ti, so I did not expect great things from this card, and I was very pleasantly surprised by how well it handled these modern games, especially the esports titles. It handled them really, really well. So I would recommend this card if you can get a good deal on it, especially if you're going to use like a Dell Optiplex or something and you don't have PCIe power that you can plug in, because this just runs off the PCIe slot. That'd be really easy. Just plug in, go, and you have a pretty well performing little GPU. I will say that it's a little bit hard to recommend a 560 right now because of the price of the RX 570s and the 580s lately. The 580 that I put in my home theater PC was like 165, and I see 570s selling all the time for like 125. And so this card is right around $100 anyways. Used, you can get them for maybe 70. So if you really have a need for a GPU that does not take external power, the 560 is a pretty solid choice. So that about sums it up. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and check out some of my other content to see the other builds and tests that I've run on other stuff and things. Thanks for watching.